Hello, welcome, and thank you for coming to our workshop, A Journey to Screen Reader Accessibility. So just a few things before we jump in. We are members of an Ableton Live product team, and we're going to be presenting along two of the three accessibility consultants who have been really instrumental to our progress. Without them, we would not be here today. And we'll start with a brief round of introductions. So, hello, my name is Spence. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a software engineer at Ableton. Amy?
Hello, my name is Amy. My pronouns are also they, them, and I am an accessibility consultant, and I've been working with this team for the last 12 months. Who'd like to go next?
Mike?
Hello, my name is Mike Verdoni. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm a product owner at Ableton. I've been working here for about 11 years. How about Lucy next?
Yeah, so I'm Lucy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm also I'm a software engineer on Live, and I've been working at Ableton for a year and a half now. And next is Laurel.
Hello, I am Laurel Pardew, and I am also a software dev at Ableton, and I use she, her as my pronouns. Tillman.
Hi,
next.
My name is Tillman Richter, and I am a user researcher in the unit that builds the live software at Ableton. And it was 1 year and a couple of weeks when I embedded with Team Rocket to investigate accessibility. He, him are the pronouns.
Thanks, everybody. So first, we're going to just give a brief overview of today's workshop. There will be 3 parts to today's workshop, covering some related topics. So topic 1 is how we started. We are going to take a high-level look at the industry, and we're going to look at our own organization, and try to also zoom out a little bit and look at what this means for other organizations. Topic 2 is what we did first. And we're going to look at some of the research that was done over the last year. And one of our consultants, Andre Louis, will give an introduction to using VoiceOver, the screen reader on macOS. In topic 3, we'll share where we are right now. We'll look at a few things related to keyboard-only interaction and start giving some introduction to the technical aspects of screen reader support. Just a shout out, much of what we'll cover today was also shared by our friends at Novation. We're going to be offering our own perspective here and some additional details that are relevant, especially if you're using a custom UI framework. If you're working with native user interface framework, something like Swift UI for iOS, then it's definitely worth your time to go and watch Novation's talk too. And why don't we kick it off then with Amy Dickens, who will be presenting Introducing Accessibility.
Sorry, I just have to find the right windows when you're doing a screen share in Zoom. It's always going to be a case of just making sure you've got everything. So, yes, I have the wonderful duty of trying to give you a whistle-stop tour of accessibility. Now, that's a really broad topic, so I'm not going to cover everything today. Don't worry. This 10 minutes is going to go quickly, but it's not going to be like, boom, 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 there's facts you need to know. As Spence said, I am Amy Dickens. I am a musician first, a researcher and a consultant, and have been doing work in accessibility with music technology for 5 years or 6 years now. I also class myself as neurodivergent. I have a form of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so that's something that I have to work with in my day-to-day work, and also helps me a lot learn about accessibility features that even I didn't know about that would help me. And if you want to speak to me a bit more about this, you can get me on Twitter at Redbox Projects, and you can also email me, which is amy@adickens.co.uk. What am I going to cover today? Well, I'm going to have a look a little bit about what accessibility means in this context. I'm also going to talk about visual impairment and the associated assistive technologies that you might encounter, look at some of the accessibility guidelines that are already out there for developing technologies, and also why you might want to include accessibility in your product development process now. So, what is accessibility? Big question. And often people think about curb cuts, ramps, subtitles. The word itself has become quite strongly associated with physical disabilities. And whilst that's a key tenet of being accessible is providing access to those with different requirements, the focus on people's ability here can sometimes be the misleading factor, because what we should actually be thinking about is a viewpoint of how to meet the requirements. Instead of like a viewpoint of how to meet the individual requirements, we should think about how our design, our content, our product itself is limiting to others, and how to expand it so that it's more comprehensible to more people. Which takes us on to a path of accessibility is inclusion, not just accessibility. And what you'll find a lot when you go into work with this and when you talk to people in the field is that a lot of people say, oh, actually, we did this small change for accessibility, but actually we had so much praise because it helped a lot of people who use our product already. So things like having subtitles, transcripts, and captioning at an event of yours, then yes, there's laws that have been created based on providing access to the deaf community. But these also things that provide for internationalization. They also help if you're following along because it's your second language, or like me, I have a very young child who likes to scream a lot when I watch things. And it's really nice to have captions so that I can follow on when I'm trying to watch something. And we also have to think about equality when we're talking about this. So it doesn't mean anything if you just provide access if the equity of the experience isn't there. Because just making something accessible and allowing somebody to make an operation on your product isn't going to make it accessible like tick. You can't just tick it off because you provided the access. Take a website, for example. If you can get to a website menu as a sighted person in 10 seconds, but somebody using your screen reader might have to navigate through a terrible navigational model and take 2 minutes to complete exactly the same action, that's not equitable experience. And that's something that we want to focus on. So in terms of digital musical instruments and digital musical technology, you also need to worry about things allowing for access, but also to not hinder creativity and be able to work in the many different contexts that musicians work in. So being creative sessions, practice, and performance. So we have a lot of space to work on these things. And it's also important to consider these things because the longer you leave it, the more accessibility debt you are actually building up. It's really easy to say, we've always done it this way. We've built with accessibility being that feature that we're going to tackle at a later date. But getting your product out the door quickly is actually just going to cause potentially more issues for accessibility, and retrofitting will be a lot harder. So no matter where you are in the development process, it's better to start considering how to do this now and gradually make small adjustments towards being more accessible. Waiting for the perfect opportunity, it's just not going to come. And also, perfection is kind of the enemy of progress when we talk about accessibility and achieving things. So I work with companies. I often talk to them about how to considering accessibility into the foundations of what they're doing instead of considering it like a feature to add later on. This isn't always possible. It's a very big luxury if you're starting from zero and being able to add stuff now. But you just have to start small and don't be too afraid to tackle these things. So today we're talking about designing for screen readers and how to get started on this particular task. And I'd first like to acknowledge that not all of us are familiar with assistive devices and technologies, and therefore I don't want to assume that you all have the knowledge of exactly what a screen reader does and where to find it. So a screen reader is a piece of software that people can use to access visual content that they're not able to perceive because of a disability. Visual information that's presented on screen is read aloud by a speech synthesizer or reproduced through a braille display. That's not something you need to worry about which format they're consuming in. When you work with the screen reader APIs, they'll output to both of those devices fine. And a braille display, if you haven't come across them, is like a row of boxes, and they have pins in, and the pins readjust so that you can read like a sentence at a time of braille information. And sometimes for people that is the preferred way of working, they might have used braille from a very young age, and braille is more comfortable for them when they're working and they don't like the distraction of having a speech synthesis. It acts as a screen reader acts as an interface between the computer operating system, the applications, and the person using the technology. And like operating systems, there are quite a few varieties of screen reader, and many people choose the one that works best for them and for their current technology setup. But context and even the program that they're using can influence which screen reader they choose to use. So some people might use one for web viewing and one for working in a particular program. So just know that that's possible too. Now, what do we mean when we say visual impairment? Well, we make an assumption a lot of the time that the only people that are using screen readers are going to be exclusively used by the blind community. And this is really incorrect. And this type of assistive technology actually benefits many, many people. So designing for the screen reader also benefits people who don't use screen readers because of the way that we work with the navigational models and things that we might change. This changes for keyboard access and many other things. So it actually really, really helps to think about the way that we design. And the majority of people who use screen readers would consider themselves to be visually impaired, but this is a wide spectrum of an accessibility requirement. So it can be very difficult to distinguish exactly who would use a screen reader and why. And so there's not a one size fits all approach to these things. So when I talk about assistive technology and when I talk about disabilities with the teams that I work with, I often try to explain that this approach of like just thinking, well, if I'm working with somebody who's blind, then surely I just need to make it accessible to a screen reader. That isn't just the answer. And often people combine lots of types of assistive technology to help them throughout their workflow. And many people have conditions that they'll know might worsen through the day or worsen depending on the context that they're in. So you have to be really flexible in the things that they might choose to use. And they might be comfortable with one type of assistive technology, but are exploring others because they know that they've got a condition that will degenerate over time. And then later on, they might be using screen reader only choices. So let's have a look at the different factors of different visual impairments. We have things like light perception, which can be a very full spectrum, from being able to see full spectrums of lights to having only being able to perceive shadows or being able to perceive no light whatsoever. Color perception in the same way, of many different types of color blindness and color conditions that affect your ability to perceive color. Light sensitivity is another. So some people might not be able to work in bright environments or dark environments, and that will very much affect their ability to use something. This is something that I experience. Having a limited field of vision, so distance or up close, or having tunnel vision, or many other different types of limited field of vision. Having involuntary eye movements is quite common with different eye conditions, depending on what has caused them, and having an ability to perceive depth and like environments around you. So the impacts of these is that you might have an inability to see detail. You might be able to see something when in different levels of clarity at distance. So not just that you have you're nearsighted or farsighted, but when you actually have something up really, really close, you can make out everything, and then It can even change your color perception in some cases. Changes in the environment can introduce new issues for you, so that can be really stressful. And that means that fatigue can occur quite often, actually, to be honest. So these are the things that kind of impact you and means that you might choose to use an assistive device. And the assistive technology that you might see used by different people with visual impairments, we've already spoken about a screen reader. You might also see people using different magnification tools. Some of these are add-ons to software add-ons to what they use on their machine already. Some of them are inbuilt into the OS. You might see people using color overlays, and these can be physical or software devices. You might see people using braille displays. As I explained, these are like a piece of hardware technology. So they actually provide pins that give you a braille output for any text that's on screen. And you might see people having changes of lighting or, specific things that change the hue of lighting on their machine over time. And also transcription software. This is commonly used when in visual impairment spaces, it's more used when you're experiencing transcription to braille. So if you'll see that this might be an extra add-on that you have to work with if somebody has a braille display that isn't outputting from a screen reader. So, and there's also a ton of adapted hardware out there. One of the great resources is if you look at the RNIB, they have a whole list of different hardwares that you can buy for visual impairments. And it can be everything from screens to adapted keypads or keyboards, or there's so much to cover that I don't think we could talk about every single device in this time. But what about actual technology guidelines? Well, the most common thing you'll see referred to across when you're looking at how do I make something accessible across the internet would be the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And we call this WCAG in the web standards community. And I think actually there's a new edition of this about to be released. But this kind of gives a guideline based on 4 key tenets, which are that things should be perceivable. So someone should be able to perceive it. It can't be invisible to all their senses. It should be operable, that an interface can't require an action that a person cannot perform. It should be understandable, so that it cannot be beyond somebody's understanding. And it must be robust. So it must be able to be interpreted reliably by a variety of user agents. And that term user agents we use in web terms to mean assistive technologies and browsers and all of the other things that you might encounter online. Doesn't really well transfer to music technology, but it's a good basis. And there's some additional context in which we might use music technology, for example, performing with others, that it just doesn't work, doesn't translate in the same way that we would use web browsing. So just know that there are some really great guidelines here and some great advice to start with in terms of what you should be looking at for screen reader descriptions and other things. But it's not going to give you the answers exactly in the world of music technology. Something that the web standards community have been working on, though, and actually the most recent updated version was this month, was the framework for accessible specification of technologies. And this is acknowledging that this web content accessibility guidelines doesn't stretch to all of the kinds of content you might find on the web, because the web, you can now access alternate, augmented reality devices and virtual reality devices through the web. It's exploring all of the different ways in which you might extend accessibility to different technologies. And that has a really nice checklist involved as well. These are some of the resources that I've put onto our worksheet that I'm sure we'll share. I can share in the chat straight afterwards if you like. And it just is a nice thing to look at if you're thinking about, okay, I really don't even know what I would start to look at in terms of assessing my technology and whether it's accessible. So start your accessibility work today is my part of the talk to encourage you to do. With visual impairments, that's 285 million people that are currently registered as having a visual impairment or disability. In terms of disability, it's a fifth of the world's population. It's about 20% of the population, and that's based on a very old statistic. So I like to think that, and it's also based on statistics where you have to disclose. So I think, to be honest, that's going to be much more. Starting with accessibility today will help you create better access for everyone. And you'll find, and I'm sure that we'll talk about this throughout, and many other companies will, but you'll have really dedicated customers who really help you through this process of working towards accessibility, and will be really, really forgiving and really, really kind and enthusiastic in working with you and getting this done. And you'll start to address your accessibility debt today. So, and don't forget, you'll probably find that you'll challenge some of your assumptions as well. And you'll learn a lot more about your own products and services than you could ever believe by handing it off to somebody who has an accessibility requirement and will tell you the ins and outs of what works and what doesn't. And it's just, it's really eye-opening when you start doing this work, but it's also very, very rewarding, and you can start to see big change in quite a small amount of time. My biggest piece of advice, though, is always ask questions and don't make assumptions. This is where we get into a lot of hot water. A lot of people struggle with talking about disability, with talking to people about their needs, and about what like how to approach even the conversation about, okay, how do you use this, or what would you do, and how, these are the things that you just need to ask up front. And if you're not sure about how somebody wants you to refer to their disability, ask them. Say, hi, I don't know, how do you like to refer to your disability? What are you comfortable talking about? And they'll tell you. And it's always best to start from that point than anything else. So thank you for listening to me. I'm sure I probably went over my time, but if you want to reach out to me, please do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike. I'm still Mike. And I want to talk about, as Spence said, changing your organization towards accessibility. Next button, please. There we go. So a lot of us in this session want to do something to make our company and its products more accessible, especially after hearing Amy's talk a few minutes ago. But often we don't really know what, we don't know how. We imagine that if we could just find the CEO of the company and tell them that they need to put out a decree that the company needs to be accessible now, that everything would be fixed. But this is unlikely to happen. I mean, most companies in this day and age don't really work by CEO decree. And the decree wouldn't really mean much because it doesn't say what exactly should change in your company and what exactly you're supposed to do. These days, it seems that organizational change happens by growing awareness, with the people doing the work pioneering the change, and then the higher-ups catch on later when the risk is much lower. Now, don't tell your CEO that that's how it actually works, but that's how it is. So how can we make an impact towards accessible products, no matter what our current position is in our company? But first, there's a big caveat. So we at Ableton aren't presenting here as market leaders in accessible software. Right now, if you connect a screen reader software to Ableton Live, basically nothing happens. It's completely opaque. We are definitely behind some other DAWs on that particular aspect. And in this talk, we're not demoing a new product, and we're not giving away a new library or a technology that's going to solve all of your problems. Because I believe that the problems are specific to your products and the solutions require organizational change. So what I'm presenting here is based on how my team is driving organizational change at Ableton, in the hope that similar techniques will work for you. So how can we start? Okay, you want to make a difference. You don't know where to begin. You don't have a team. You don't have a scope. You don't have a budget. You're not an expert in accessible tech. To begin, just do something. Do anything you can. Often the first choice is accepting that you can't do a project that's going to make a product accessible to everyone, because so many people have completely different needs. You might have to start by just picking one particular aspect of accessibility and working on that. So at Ableton, we picked visual impairment, and our original rationale was just because it seemed unfair that a tool that is designed for creating music, which is an art form that is traditionally considered to be, fully enjoyable despite any level of visual impairment, would be unable to be used by those same people. So, okay, let's say we make that choice. What can we do? What can you do? Well, depending on your role, there's a bunch of things. If you're a developer, just build some kind of prototype. Connect your application to an OS accessibility API and see what happens. Or maybe just get a speech synthesizer and put that in your hardware or software, make it say a few things. It's sort of the bare minimum, but it can work. If you're a designer, you can just imagine that you had a speech synthesizer or access to an accessibility API. And then you just think about, well, what voice prompts would I want in my application? What would I expect the application to say when I hit a button or do a particular thing? If you're a user researcher, you're in a great position. Make contact with some visually impaired artists and ask them what they do now. What software, hardware do they currently use? How do they wish that they could use your products? Okay, now you've done all that you can on your own. What's the next thing to do? Next thing is form a not so secret club. So once you've done a bit of work yourself, seek out someone in another role to help out. So again, if you're a developer and you've got your cool prototype that can speak a few words, bring it to a designer and say, hey, I've got this prototype and this is how it works. Do you think that makes sense? Maybe we can design this better. Or you can bring it to a user researcher and say, look at this thing. Who could possibly use this? Maybe you have some contacts. Maybe you can find some people to try it out and just, talk about it. Really what you're kind of doing is building a cross-functional team, which is a really cool buzzword in this sort of industry. Now, this team is not official. You're probably going to use some hack time or some Slack time or just time on the side to do this. You'll have occasional meetings, but it's just enough to get the ball rolling and to talk to people outside of your direct team and see if you can develop a new team. I'm assuming here that your companies support having some unstructured Slack time. If they don't, tell them that they should, because it's a great way to develop new ideas, which turn into new products, which turn into money. It's a recommendation from Ableton. You can tell them we said that. So at some point, your prototype or your idea has gotten pretty far, and you end up in that position where you have to call the product owner. You want to go legit with your work, and that means bringing the product owner in, or a project manager, or a product manager. It depends. The titles are always different in every company. Product owners are frequently grumpy. They need to be convinced that a project makes sense to work on. So you need some arguments about why the company should spend time on all this accessibility stuff. Now, I'm here to give you some arguments that you can use. So the first one is sort of a moral argument. Does your company value having a community of users, and does it value diversity in that community? I would say that most companies would say yes. Well, if that's the case, accessibility makes perfect sense. A diversity of ability is key in a user community. And enabling access is, I think, one of the key things that product developers can do to increase diversity in the customer community. But the product owner might say, well, yeah, but that's not going to make much money. There's an opportunity cost to doing accessibility work. You're not building that hit new synthesizer. You're doing this accessibility stuff instead. Well, you have to lean on your company culture. If your company has a commitment to a goal like diversity or sustainability, that means that they have to forego some amount of profitable projects to do projects that further their commitment instead. A company's culture, hello, computers. Sorry about that. Lost my notes, sorry. Yeah, a company's culture is seen really through not what it says, but what it does. So if your company says that they value diversity, but they won't commit to projects that will further that goal because they don't want to lose profit, do not accept that. push your leaders to maintain their stated commitments. All right, we need more arguments though. Some people are a bit hard-headed against moral arguments. We need something else. Well, one thing you might have noticed when building accessibility prototypes or any previous accessibility projects you've done is that they often make your products better for everyone, or they make your workflow easier. So here's a concrete example. During the development of Live 10, the designers and developers stressed a lot about the color theme, which is ironic because Live's interface is pretty much just shades of gray. At the time, we had over 50 of them. Designers had a lot of tense arguments about aesthetics. And then we came up with a theme that we liked, we released it. And after the release, we got feedback that Live 10's theme was really hard to read. And it was basically unusable for people who had virtually any degree of visual impairment. So for Live 11, we said, hey, we should fix that. We learned about the WCAG, these web guidelines. We learned about contrast ratios. And now we had a measurable indicator of whether our user interface was readable. So we now had fewer arguments about aesthetics of colors. What mattered now was contrast and readability. Live 11 shipped with a lot more contrast than Live 10 with a new theme. And that improved contrast made it easier to read for pretty much everyone using it, not just these people with visual impairment that we imagined that it would help. It also, in the end, made our user interface design process clearer for new features because we had clear requirements for readability. In the end, it drove some organizational change in the design department that made things better and made our products better. Virtually every accessibility project that we've worked on so far has produced benefits for customers who the change was not originally intended to serve, and also improved the way that we design and ship products. So that's a really good argument. Use that one. I have one more argument though. Do you like it when your products are used in schools and universities? You know, the education market is really important. However, schools have to cater to students who have sensory or cognitive impairments, different levels of ability, etc. Now, sometimes a teacher might substitute one product for another for a particular student if the original product doesn't work for them. But over time, it might be better to just throw out that inaccessible product and replace it with one that works for more students. So how would you like your product kicked out of schools and made unavailable to your next generation of customers? That would be bad. So there's a third argument for accessibility. All right, you've convinced the product owner. You do a project, it's time to go on. What happens next? So you do this work with a cross-functional team of developers, designers, and user researchers. You bring in some expert consultants and some users to give feedback on your work, which is really important. As Amy said, you have to ask, don't assume. By the way, there's a lot of passionate experts on the topic of accessibility and music. There are at least 2 of them in this talk, and there are more of them who presented already at this conference. I'm sure you can find people. So you do the project, it's complete. You're done, right? That's it, it's accessible now. No, that's not how it works. You can't just do accessibility. Now, you've enabled access for a subset of users that you've identified, but there's always more people that you can reach. However, after this first project, hopefully you've experienced some organizational change for the better. So maybe your designers are arguing less about aesthetics and more about contrast, or they're thinking about information architecture for keyboard navigation when they're laying out widgets. You know, maybe your code is improved. You've got accessibility hooks enabled in your Vue framework. You're definitely now in a better position to start on another accessibility project and capitalize on your last one. So the ultimate result of doing accessibility projects is not that your products are just accessible, but that they stay accessible. Your organization builds an accessibility during the whole product development process. It isn't an exception or a special case. So this is a concrete example of an organization that's building products that support screen readers for the visually impaired. And this is kind of what it would look like. Your user researchers are in frequent contact with visually impaired users, and the requirements of these users are feeding into the feature development process. Your designers are considering accessibility requirements like image contrast and keyboard navigation, screen reader narration from the beginning. And this is making design outcomes better for all your users. The developers have accessibility features enabled in the code base, which means that by default, any user interfaces they build are keyboard navigable and support screen readers, at least to some degree. There are integration tests for screen reader support as well, just as there are for other product features. Your QA department has visually impaired people in their group of testers, and the bug reports from these testers are handled and fixed just like any other. Your marketing department has ensured that marketing materials are accessible. For instance, the company website can be read with a screen reader. And your support team members understand how screen readers work and can offer support to users with screen readers for all product features. Sounds great. So once again, though, I want to stress that I'm not claiming that this is where we're at with Ableton. This is what my team are trying to achieve. I'm sharing this with you now in the hope that you can start similar transformations in your own companies. And also because I really want to hear from you who have tried similar things. And I want to learn from you what worked and what didn't. Does anything I've said in this presentation make sense, or is it completely wrong? Let me know. In the end, I think that we can transform our organizations from the inside. And when that change is almost done, then the presidents and CEOs will stand up to proclaim that accessibility is a core value in their company, but we'll know how they got there. So as I said, I'd love to hear from people making similar changes in their companies. My email is on the screen. It's mike.verdone@ableton.com. And Verdone is spelled Verdone. You can also find me on LinkedIn and various social network places. I'd really love to hear about your experiences. Thank you. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. So now we're going to introduce some questions for reflection. We're just going to spend 5 minutes gathering responses to these questions. So please, if you feel like it, you can either raise your hand or post in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. So where are you in terms of being accessible? Are you just getting into researching it, or do you have working prototypes, or is your application already somewhat accessible and you're just trying to find improvements where you can? Another question is, what is your role in adopting accessibility practices? Are you a product owner like Mike who can prioritize it within your team? Are you a designer who can bring up accessibility concerns when discussing designs with other teams or within your own team? Are you a developer and you could build an accessibility prototype or find time in your regular schedule to add new accessibility features? And third, what are the barriers you might encounter when getting started? Do you have a grumpy product owner? Do you have a CEO who doesn't understand that accessibility brings business value? Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. So looks like we have a few things in the chat. Stefan Schönefeld. Number 1, at the beginning, researching how to approach it. Thank you for sharing, Stefan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Spence. Yeah, my name is Tilman Richter, and I am a user researcher in the live product team at Ableton. And like I said, I embedded with Team Rocket last year to join the VI accessibility research. User research is a common practice at Ableton, and so I'd like to give you an overview over what we did there, all of us together. Before going into the insights, I'd like to outline our process, since I don't want to assume that everyone knows how user research works. So what I will be talking about today are the results from a study that qualifies as generative user research, where you look to explore a certain domain or problem space to identify opportunities for contribution to the experience of the actors and users in that domain. We do other kinds of research too, like summative research, where design is being tested for usability, etc. But this particular study, where the insights come from that I will talk about, was generative user research. So the first thing we did is to team up with consultants, was already mentioned, but as a company, we have little knowledge about accessible product design. So we decided to just, get together with some people who know about this more. So we first got in touch with Andre Louis and Amy and Tim Burgess also. And with their help, we are able to better plan our studies and recruit the wider user expert panel and make sense of our findings. Jason, who's also attending, is also part of our panel, together with his wife, Sarah. Once we were set up, we planned this initial study, which starts with the findings of research questions. And Zoom is telling me that my internet connection is unstable. Oh, wow. Sorry for that. I am hooked up to a LAN, so this is actually all I can do right now. Very strange. It was great the first hour. Let me just try to continue, and if it gets too bad, just stop me. So our research questions were, who are visually impaired DAW users as music makers, and what's their experience? Pretty high level. When it came to recruiting participants, working with Andre and Tim paid off immediately, because in no time we were able to recruit a big panel of very experienced visually impaired music makers and DAW users. And many of them are actually more than users of software. They are actually people who contribute actively to making music tech accessible. So we hit a jackpot. And then it was time to gather data, which means almost a year ago, we took a two-week sprint to interview 23 musicians online via Zoom and have them tell their story and walk us through their process. And then we gathered a lot of data from that, of course, and spent quite some time analyzing it. And the data is in fact so rich that there's still more to synthesize from it. But I'm going to give you a high-level overview of what we found, because it's the input for our design and development thinking. So insights about the experience is the first thing I want to talk about. So here you see a screenshot here on my slide deck. You see screenshots of Bitwig, FL Studio, Ableton Live, the Electron Octatrack hardware, Ableton Push, Native Instrument Machine, the Superior Drummer plugin, Massive X, Isotope Ozone. So in our domain, when I usually do user research, these are all staples. Like, people talk about these all the time. But in the conversations we had with visually impaired music makers, they didn't come up at all, or they were mentioned as not being accessible, because none of this stuff is accessible actually. And that was the first thing that I learned, that there's a big discrepancy in what's available. But I learned more things. So first of all, there's a great community of VI music technologists to collaborate with. Right? It was to begin with, it was very easy to recruit participants to our research. And when we got together, we met amazing musicians who reflect on their experience of technology and are very happy to share about it. That's not always the case when you do user research. Well, it made the work a breeze, and we made many relevant connections in a very short amount of time. We also learned that accessible music tech makes dedicated VI customers. So this is with all users of music tech, this is the case. Once a musician is committed to a piece of technology because it is important to their process, a special relation forms, right? The relation of a music maker with their instrument. So yeah, we met the same kind of people who are dedicated, which doesn't mean they're not uncritically, right? But dedicated to the DAWs and plugins and hardware that they use. So like many other users of music tech, also these people are looking for inspiring new creative options. Then a third thing that we really had to spell out for ourselves and make it very clear: our products, Live, Ableton Live, Push, and Max for Live, can't be used by blind music makers. Fourth thing, existing accessibility is often under design. So we learned that there are DAWs and plugins and music tech that is somewhat accessible, but there are often issues present that block or break real user flow. And I'm going to share about those next. On a high level, though, 2 more points. Accessibility doesn't end at the boundaries of a product. Mike already hinted at that, right? Complex music tech products don't come alone. They are released with documentation and inspiring video content, all that stuff that helps with onboarding and getting the most out of these products. So when considering accessibility, all this stuff needs to be considered as well. So for example, in videos, what is being shown when that is not described, it makes it hard to follow. Or if a manual makes use of images to onboard a user to an interface, but the images, they are not, they can't be read by a screen reader, so the images are not there. So it's of little use. This kind of stuff is important as well. And then last but not least, music tech goes back to being inaccessible. That apparently happens a lot because accessibility is, that's the thing, when accessibility is considered as this one-time effort, but software development being iterative and things constantly changing and breaking, when accessibility is then considered a one-time effort, it might not last very long. We heard some pretty terrible stories, but on that topic, but for the sake of time, I'd move on and get a bit more specific. When it comes to the common issues that exist in accessible interface design. So the semi-accessible interface design. So what did we learn that is specifically relevant for interface design? There are quite a few things. There are more things that I can cover today. And Amy is working on a report that we hopefully will be able to share with you in the future if you're interested. So let's make a connection. Also, please reach out. But for now, I'll go over some of these most common issues that we should aim to avoid. The first one is called keyboard wells. So a keyboard well occurs when a user has to navigate through excessive amounts of lower level objects to go between similar higher level objects of the information architecture. And because this is pretty abstract, I'd like to illustrate the issue. Here you see on my slide deck a screenshot of an EQ, Ableton Live's EQ8. And this EQ has 8 filters, and each filter has 4 parameters that can be chosen from. It's like a pretty standard EQ. Now, in my illustration next, this is abstracted to these 8 filter bands with 4 parameters each. And if you want to, for example, go from filter 1 to filter 8, and you use a mouse, you are on filter 1, on the frequency for filter 1, and you just click on the frequency for filter 8, and you're there. It's like 2 interactions. But often what happens when you use a screen reader and the computer keyboard, you have to go through this keyboard well, where you have to go through all the parameters of all the filters in between 1 and 8. So you have to go to filter 8 frequency. So it's 30-something interaction steps. A second common issue is inconsistent support for accessible navigation. This comes in several flavors. The first one is when there are simply when there are items in the user interface without any screen reader narration, without any labels. For example, in my abstracted EQ, this would be if the filter activator and frequency parameters wouldn't have any labels, so you wouldn't know where they are or what state they're in. A second flavor of inconsistent support for accessible navigation would be if bigger parts of an application are completely inaccessible. So translated to my EQ example, this would occur if only bands 1 and 8 were actually labeled or could be read out by the screen reader, but bands 2 to 7 were not. So you don't know what is in between 1 and 8. So especially when keyboard wells occur in combination with unlabeled stuff, people can get completely lost. The third common issue is information that is not useful is being read out by the screen reader. So we'll talk a bit more about screen reader label design later. And it's important to acknowledge that verbosity is a pretty complex topic because it can be a matter of preference when, for example, more experienced users need lower verbosity than beginning users of a certain piece of tech. So there's a lot to learn about how to specifically design for the different need states of music makers that use screen readers. But maybe a common issue that is that can be abstracted on is like when information that is not usually relevant is read out by the screen reader before information that is usually relevant. A fourth issue common is that after changes have been made, the new status is not announced. So you don't know if your interaction actually had any effect. And a last one to point out is that sometimes drag and drop is the only available interaction for certain tasks, which doesn't do anything for you if you can't use your mouse to point and click at things. So yeah, these kinds of issues, especially in combination, can really lead to people getting stuck to the point where they have to close the software and start over. Or they have to bring in a sighted person for assistance, and that person might have no clue about the software in question. So in any case, these issues prevent flow and make for frustrating experiences, despite people thinking that their product is accessible. So this is actually the end of my part. We started with user research, but you don't have to do that. The easiest thing to do is actually start with some self-testing. So how about trying to use your product with a screen reader? And this is where I'd like to hand over to Andre Louis, who can give you a demo on how to use VoiceOver on Mac, and perhaps even touch on some of the issues that I touched on in abstract as well.
Okay, well, let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Andre Louis, and I'm a sort of blind producer, music guy from London. Yes, Ableton testing. That was very interesting. We came across some interesting bugs, and but that's not the end of it. Like I say bugs in my opening statement, and everybody's going, "Uh-oh, it's better than that." The fact that we went from something that we couldn't use to something that we could at least view was fantastic. But I can't really talk about that too much. But what I can talk about is day-to-day screen reader use. And as a screen reader user from the age of dot, I don't know when I started using one, I'm kind of fairly understanding of them by now. In front of me, because I don't do PowerPoint, is just a text file that anybody can screen cap if they like. For my blind followers in the room, this is just a quick text file with what I'm about to tell you in it as well. So, if you are in this room right now, albeit virtual, socialdistancing.com, then there's a 99.9% chance you have access to a screen reader this very second. Whether it's your iPhone or Mac, whether it's your Android smartphone, even your smart television, Windows, Linux, you probably have access to a screen reader. I was going to say 100%, but then there's always that one person, the outlier, and someone has just stolen my window. Zoom, floating windows. I hate them with a fiery passion of 1,000 screen reading suns. Here we go, back again. So I'm going to quickly tell you how to enable VoiceOver, but I'm also going to reference Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and say that if you do this, particularly on your smartphone, if you do this, you're going to lose all of your standard gesture controls, but the Hitchhiker's Guide says, don't panic. Please do not sue me for copyright. But this is something to note. The amount of frantic calls I've had from people saying, I enabled VoiceOver and I turned on screen curtain and I can't use my phone, so I'm borrowing a friend's. What do I do? First of all, you don't panic. All right. Oh, sorry. Zoom is talking and it won't shut up unless you're in the window. That's the trouble with Zoom chat. My bad. Right, so enabling VoiceOver is actually quite simple. So in the case of iOS, you've got at least two options to begin with. You can ask Siri to enable VoiceOver. I'm not going to say, hey, you know what? It might do bad things in the room. You can also visit Settings, Accessibility, VoiceOver, and then at the top you can tap Turn VoiceOver on or words to that effect. And then to turn it off, you need to first put your finger on that off button and then double tap it. Because if you do what you normally do as a sighted user with iOS and just double tap that the part of the screen, it's not going to do anything. And that is because all the gestures kind of get one more layer deep in a lot of cases. So it can really throw you to begin with. Fear not, though, it's doable. macOS, you've got two options. If you are one of these unfortunate people with a touch bar, I just got rid of mine, yay, and I don't miss it, then you have to enable VoiceOver with holding the command button down and pressing the power button 3 times quickly. Fear not, this won't bring Candyman to your door. If you don't have a touch bar and you have function keys, long-lived function keys, you can do Command F5. Just once. If you do it again, it will send VoiceOver off. And if you have function keys and a Touch ID sensor, like both of my Macs do, you have the choice and you can pick and choose whichever you prefer. Because choice is awesome. I'll briefly touch on TalkBack as well, just because, it's not just iOS users in the room or macOS users. So Android, you need to go to Settings, Accessibility, TalkBack, and Enable TalkBack. And that's also down here. There we are. Voice View, Kindle Fire. You can get a tablet with a screen reader on it for all of $50, £50, €50, I think, on Amazon. Crazy. Comes with a fully fledged screen reader, and it is no joke. It's a really good screen reader. Has some of the best Braille support, for example, in the business, as I'm told. I've never used it with Braille support, but it is a thing. Settings, Accessibility, Voice View screen reader, and turn it on. And finally, Windows, particularly 10 and 11, you've very got it easy. Control Windows Enter. Screen readers for everyone. I couldn't have made it to this conference without a screen reader. I couldn't use Logic, which is my DAW of choice, without a screen reader. The screen reader is vital to my everyday usage. It's incredible, and it's come so far. Screen readers have come so far in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's kind of unbelievable. I mean, it was only a few years ago, for example, that installing some software was so difficult to do that it was necessary to employ somebody who could see. I call her Wi-Fi's 1.0. That's not to say that I want a second one, by the way, but, it's fun. There was a screen reader called Window Eyes, and I sort of based it off of that. My lovely wife helped me out greatly. And now my son, who's 12, and I growed him just to help me with screen reader tasks, is great at that too. So if one can't, the other can. It's awesome. But these days, it's rarer and rarer, and I like to see that, by the way, because it's very empowering as a blind person that we need screen readers, helpers, that I should say, less and less. So, I want to talk about verbosity, and I want to show you what the voice of a screen reader can sound like when it's at a high rate of speed, because I'm impatient and my screen reader is very fast, as the Ableton team can attest to. So let me press a couple buttons and you can hear what I hear. 1, 2, like that. There we go. So this is a text edit window that you've seen so far if you've been seeing in the room.
VoiceOver.
That says VoiceOver.
Return new line.
And that says return new line. Why it says both, I don't know.
macOS. CMD plus F5.
CMD plus F5.
CMD plus Touch ID 3 times.
CMD plus Touch ID 3 times.
New line.
I can speak as fast as it can.
iOS. Settings rate accessibility rate VoiceOver.
And so on. But if I slow it down to a more listenable rate for those in the room who cannot follow.
Rate 100. 95%. 90%. 70%. Closing edit text. Return.
Bit more.
Rate 65%. 60. Closing rate. Edit text. TalkBack on Android. Return new line. Voice View on Amazon Kindle Fire. Settings greater accessibility greater Voice View screen reader.
It's still quick, but hopefully it's a little better. So I wanted to talk about verbosity because Till touched on that as well. So I'm going to switch to Logic now by hiding this window with Command H.
Finder.
And switching to Logic with Command and Tab.
Text Zoomos. Logic Pro.
Here it is.
Track 3 clarinet. Track 2 bass. Track 1 piano.
So I have a few tracks in here. Now, I work with vocalists. I track vocalists in the studio here. My studio, by the way, is my living room behind me. I call it the studio because it sounds grander than it actually is. And I have to deal with a lot of silly verbosity things quite often. And also the placement of important things would be nice to be able to change as well, but unfortunately you can't. One of the most egregious things I think I come across on a daily basis is this message.
Toggle channel strip mute on.
And for those of you who didn't catch that, that was toggle channel strip mute on. Could you just give me mute on?
Toggle channel strip mute off.
Same for solo if I press S, and solo is at one extra syllable.
Toggle channel strip solo on.
It's ridiculous.
Toggle channel strip solo off.
So in a hurry when I need to go down the track list, I want the shortest possible answer to give me the most concise possible answer. Yeah? That's one of the most important things I think I come across, and it just really, really bugs me. But I was going to quickly do a silly demo for you.
1 bar.
I was going to record something, and then I was going to make a mistake in part of it, or at least, you know, something I could fix, and show you what it's like for a screen reader to edit a MIDI event view, because a lot of people get curious about this thing. So I have a little ditty I made about half an hour ago, which is pointless, and it goes like this. All right, it's very
11
boring.
bars, 1 bit, 73 ticks.
I'm going to drop down an octave now.
Octave -1.
And I've got a bass in front of me. It's a nice upright bass. So why don't I just quickly put a jazz bass in for you
1 bar.
real quick. And I want to talk about this. I'm going to hit, like, for example, this note. A, it's loud, and B, I can adjust it and show you how it's like to adjust it in a DAW like this. So let's see what we get. See this last note? I didn't want it to be that. So why didn't I jump into the old event view here? Let me quantize it, by the way.
Quantize selected region cell Larry Logic.
So I'm now in this event view. Hopefully you can see that on the screen, and there's just lots of notes and random bits and pieces. So if I go down this list,
8 items selected.
and here's an issue, here's a bug with Logic. When I go down the list,
8 items selected.
it says 8 items selected. It doesn't actually tell me what I'm highlighting. So I would have to actually go into the table and work at it. But all I'm going to do is just quickly scroll down.
8 items selected.
And here's the note. So I found the note I wanted just by listening to it, and then I can simply do Option up and down and fix it. But if I was going to fix it with a screen reader, which is what we're going to do today, I would have to interact with this table.
In table, column 1, row 40, column 2, row 40. 1011 scrubber group.
And then we
No
have
cell.
all this information, which at first glance looks really complicated, and for a new user would be quite complicated. And I think that DAWs have to consider how they express this information to users, because it could be quite problematic.
M, column 2, row 40 empty. L, empty cell length info. 00653 scrubber group. Column 8.
00653. It's not telling you bars and beats and things. It's bars, beats, ticks, and everything. But it's the way it's presented, and I know that because I've been a Logic user for 5 years. But you know, and this is just like one of these many things that as a blind producer you have to deal with on a daily basis. But I thought it was worth showing. So
Val, 86 slider.
that's velocity.
Num, F1 slider.
Num F1, which is the note number. So there are times when I think wording could be more useful, like note instead of num, or note num. And there are times when it's actually not useful. And so you just, yeah, it just depends. So in this case, I need to now select the slider
In slider.
by interacting with it. And then I can just
E1, D1,
drop it
D1,
down
C1, C1, C1.
and see how that
Out of
sounds.
slider. 8 items selected.
I think I changed the wrong one, but you get the idea.
In F4. Out of 8 items selected.
It's a longer slide now. So that's a little bit about editing with a screen reader in Logic. Other DAWs will vary. Everybody does it differently. And to be honest, I suppose as an end user, I have no reason to complain or right to complain, but I sort of feel like if I've got to use it, I need it to be the way that I'd like it to be. And sometimes this lack of information can be a pain, and sometimes too much information can be a pain. And there has to be a nice middle ground. I think part of it boils down to, as a screen reader user, I need a lot more customizability of accessibility and verbosity. In the same way that you can have dark mode and you can have hot corners for your mouse to click and so on. I'd love if more app developers decided to give us more granularity in their apps, in their programs, so that we could do more things better. Because what I want is not what everybody wants. And your monitor rig with your 2 4K screens or 8 6K screens is not what everybody else needs either. But you have, as a sighted user, probably anyway, far more ability to change the way and the look of things, dragging your windows around to look better so that you don't have to lift your eyes above a certain level, the colors, the contrast. But as a screen reader user, more often than not, what we hear is what we get. And I find that quite problematic. So I don't want to end on a low note or anything, but I just want to just keep it real here. Till, how did I do? And have you got anything to say based on what I said?
Thanks, first of all. And these are good points, and we constantly need to be reminded about them because there's a lot to do. I have some questions for everyone in the session. How similar to the last section we did. There's actually a third one that we could add to this. That is, what would you find using a screen reader with your product today?
If I were to open up Ableton Live and turn on VoiceOver on my computer, it says untitled window. That's about it.
That's it.
Are there any other common products we can think of that are worth testing?
Any browser.
A new browser.
Any browser is quite interesting because different browsers will present slightly differently.
Could you give us an example?
Yeah, the other day, for example, I was trying to register, believe it or not, the irony is real, passenger assistance to book a train for tomorrow. I've got a gig. So I went on a company's website and I tried to book this passenger assistance, and nearly all the fields were very nice. One of the fields was, what time are you traveling? Now, it says edit field. It doesn't say like it's a read-only field. I tried to type a time into this field and I couldn't tab out of it. I could not escape this field for love nor money. So I asked somebody in the house to help me. It turns out there's a picker at the bottom of the screen, which was up, but the screen reader did not report it, and I had to have them click the time, and as soon as they clicked the second number, the page crashed. There were very blue words in the room at that time. So, yeah, pages. And I tried a few different browsers, a few different screen reader combinations. The page sucked. And the thing is with a page, because unlike an app, you can probably change that a lot faster. So if you're a web administrator and you do things like that, test with a screen reader too. It's very, very important, especially these days, because you'll just lose customers.
Thanks for sharing that. I know personally, so the first time I ever really saw someone using a screen reader was Andre. A little over 2 years ago. Hard to believe.
It's gone fast.
Yeah. Another user researcher at Ableton, Sabina, and I visited Andre with a very, very early hack of a prototype. And just getting this poorly implemented prototype onto Andre's computer and watching him immediately run into frustration. I mean, we learned right away that the assumptions we had about how people use a screen reader, what's important, just fell apart, which is a great thing. We learned a lot just by getting Andre and a few others to just try it and be frustrated and share those frustrations with us. This was worthwhile time spent. We've got a bit of extra time. I'm wondering if we want to invite anybody from the audience to share their answers to these questions.
Can I just say something as well before I go?
Of course.
I'd like to say that it's not all doom and gloom. There are really great strides being made, for example, in Juice. Juice accessibility in the last 6 months has come such a long way, like an unbelievable amount, to the point where I used 2 products in this little demo on purpose. I used Piano Tech from Modarts and I used Swam Clarinet from Audio Modeling. And these 2 companies have gone out of their way to do accessibility in their plugin windows correctly. And I use that just, I was going to showcase it, but I was very aware of the time. But, I can always do an internal video or something and show this to people interested. But it's really great to see. There are many plugins that are still not accessible because they're not using Juice framework. But my hope is now that because Juice is at 6.1, I think, has accessibility built in, and it's an official branch now, that more people will really, really consider using Juice. it is absolutely a game changer. And I hate that phrase, but there are so many things in life right now that appear to be just that I kind of have to. So yeah.
We do have quite a bit of time left over in the hour. I'm wondering if you would be willing to show us what you mean by the fact that these companies did a really great job.
Yeah, I can take over screen again and I'll send speech through again. Give me a second. Sort my life out.
Can I just add that that's really nice to hear, actually, because I think I, for one, I knew that it was coming and I knew that the accessibility had started, but I didn't know what it was like in day-to-day workflows. Yeah, I hadn't had any feedback on how well it was doing as an accessibility update. So it's really good to know that people are actually taking the right steps to make things really good.
Oh, it's massive. Really, really incredible. And I shouldn't probably plug it, but I'll just say I did a video on my channel about Pianotex accessibility specifically. It's about 40 minutes. I go into quite in-depth detail about how their plugin UI looks to a screen reader user, because I think it's interesting.
Track 2, track 1 piano.
But I have not shown SWAM before. So I'll show you Pianotex now. Hopefully the thing doesn't crash and burn.
A dialog box.
All right, we've got a dialog.
Juice application group.
So I've gone to the end of the window, and the first thing that would normally happen when I get to the end of window in a Logic plugin is just I would see this checkbox,
link unticked checkbox,
this link checkbox, and nothing else. But now, one more step to the right,
Juice application group.
We have this Juice application, and if I interact with it, there's a lot of things I can see in here.
In Juice application group, 35 items, node edit button, morphing/layers button, options button, help button, previous preset button, current preset, ONJ's jazz, modified button.
And that's a preset that I made, so I can change the preset directly from here, which is fantastic.
Next open preset manager button.
There's a huge preset manager in there.
Save preset button.
Can save it. So not only can a blind user actually make something with a plugin, which is something that we always crave to do, and I'm hoping that eventually we'll see some really great synthesizers step up to the plate and give us that kind of accessibility as well, from being able to load sound in, and with the waveforms and actually save your own preset instead of having someone else have to do it for you, which is really boring.
Copy dialog button.
But there's a lot to be done in here, so it's very cool.
Paste button, freeze dialog button, randomize button.
And each of these, I think, has a help tag.
Set all parameters to random values. Hold the button for 1 second, or right-click to reduce the randomization amount.
So if I use the key VoiceOver Shift H, it reads out the tooltip. So there's stuff like that. They've really gone out of their way to make this fantastic. So that's just one, and I'll show you the clarinet as well. It's a totally different UI.
Track 2 bass.
But because it's in Logic, you kind of get that, that understanding of where I'm going.
Track 3 clarinet.
Right, clarinet time. Again,
clarinet dial.
Okay.
Clarinet. Toolbox SWAM clarinet 3 group.
So this one, instead of saying Juice application, they've titled it SWAM clarinet 3, and if I interact, it's a different UI.
In SWAM clarinet 3 group, 39 items, previous preset classical button. Jazz, current preset, jazz. Next preset pop button. MIDI controller mapping button. Main menu button. Open about view button. Clarinet V300.
So it's telling me stuff that I could only ever really see if I used OCR before. So there's a lot to learn. And one of the other interesting things that I noticed is that another plugin manufacturer, UVI, have started building with this Juice framework, but I don't think they did it on purpose. Because a lot of controls don't work. So I think they've kind of done accidental accessibility, which is kind of funny. So a lot of plugins do appear like similar to this, but they have lots of missing buttons, and a lot of it is just kind of guesswork and inference. But hey, it's better than not having it at all. I'll take accidental accessibility over no accessibility any day of the week, because I have a much higher chance of being able to do anything meaningful other than just faff around with presets and do nothing more than that. And I think that is the problem that a lot of producers run into when you can't see. If you don't have access to anything, then it's just preset heaven, and that's all you've got. And presets mean that you can't really be distinctive, you're predictable, your sound is, everybody has that sound because it's just a bunch of presets. But with access to Juice and things like this, you, as a plugin developer, you open up your world to a lot more people, and that is money for you and music for us. That should be on a t-shirt. So that's just one thing. Here's a plugin that doesn't work with Juice, and it's Contact.
Track 2 bass.
I'm going to use this bass plugin.
Bass dialog.
So
bass dialog.
You can probably see a lot on the screen, but I'm going to go to the end of the window here.
Link unticked checkbox.
And it just shows the link, and I can't go any further.
Link unticked.
See, normally I would be able to interact one step ahead like I did with the 2 previous Juice plugins and see something about the plugin, but there's nothing I can see here. There's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can change. So yeah, I mean, I know that NI isn't using Juice in their setups yet. I think they're using Qt for some stuff. So Qt also, like Juice, is becoming slowly accessible, but I think Juice is really far ahead and has raised the bar so high that everyone is playing catch up at this point. So yeah, 2 accessible plugins, 1 inaccessible plugin. And when you see that, you just sigh and you move on, because what else can you do? So I'm actively looking now for plugins that support Juice, and I will hand you my money. Look, just take it. I'm throwing it at you. So if you're a plugin developer and you use Juice, tell me about it. So yeah, a few thoughts on Juice.
Thanks a lot, Andre. Yeah, we had the pleasure of getting to meet Ed Davies at ADC this week. I did, and I guess Amy, you were there too. Ed is one of the folks at Juice who did a lot of the work on bringing that accessibility support to the framework. So big hats off to Ed and the folks at Juice who made that happen. Clearly it's a big change, and it's something that we're hoping to live up to. We could go back to the questions for reflection, and maybe we as a team could share some of our reflections on this, if anybody would like to speak up. Andre, I'm going to kick you off the share.
Yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question here that reads, who could you involve both inside and outside of your organization? I think when we actually want to make progress, we also need to get the experiences of people who are not such wizards as Andre. You know, maybe less experienced music makers, and see how that looks. That is, I think, also very interesting to learn more.
Yeah, I agree there. You've got such a landscape when you're talking about musicians and music makers, that everything from the novice to the pro, and everything from somebody who works mostly with hardware to somebody who's completely in the box in software land. So you really have to work with lots of different people to experience all of the pain points. And there's a lot of pain points that you're going to come across, but it's really, really helpful to expose as many of them as you can early on, because you might find, whilst there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, there's something that you can change that's quite small, but actually has a really big impact across this spectrum of people that are using this feature or whoever's there. I also like to thank Andre for showing the tooltip help things, because that's one way around verbosity. So if you're not sure what you should be putting in there and you're worried that it's not descriptive enough, you can always add into a tooltip to give that extra functionality for somebody who might be like, oh, I need more info about this.
Just one example of like a knock-on effect of accessibility is for a long time, people have been requesting the ability to turn off the grid lines in Live's arrangement view. And with the release of Live 11, we enabled that in the look and feel settings. There's a slider where you can turn it down to 0 and the grid lines on the arrangement timeline are gone. And while this is useful for people with different sensory issues, the way they process visual information. It's also great for people who like to make drone music, who are just tired of the grid being so oppressive over their thought process and their work process. So, we're addressing feedback from users who either want to see the grid lines more strongly or have them go away entirely. And that's helping people with their musical process too.
Yeah, Kiam Alami made that exact point on Tuesday in his talk about cultural biases in music technology, that just even if the grid doesn't quantize, just seeing the grid makes you make music in a certain way, and turning it off is scary. But once you've overcome that fear, then you actually make music differently. Culturally, it's a very interesting topic. This knockoff effect you mentioned.
And that goes back to what Andre was saying about choice. Just having a couple more choices in what you're doing can be really, really helpful. And it is a real damn shame at the moment that most plugins that you come across are like only the presets are accessible, because that's a very limited choice, with some of those plugins, you know, having 1,000 different configurable data points in them, and you can't do anything with them other than quickly change a preset. That's something that you should really think about. Like, you know, if you're thinking about testing A or B, why do you need to have one choice? Would be the other question to think about. Because if it comes back that, you know, 50% like A and 50% like B, then you might as well just give people the option to choose one or the other.
Yeah, especially in our domain, also electronic music, maybe, or our domain, but you know, in electronic music, sound design and movement in timbre is so important. And like Andre said, right? You said, Andre, that the signature sounds and like carving your own sounds is just an important part of being a producer. And if that is all not available,
yeah, it is. And it gives us the ability to share our sounds with the world. Right now, we'd just be sharing other people's presets with the world, and no one needs that.
Right. Is there any good synth plugin where you can do sound design from scratch?
Well, as of last week, I heard of one which I have installed but not tested at all, really, called Surge, which is also Juice. And Surge is free, a completely free synth, and they have nightly builds, and they're using Juice, and it's great. There are pre-Juice synths, like, for example, well, I don't know about complete sound design, but for example, if you use Alchemy in Logic or Sculpture, these are not using Juice, they're using Apple's framework, and you can do a lot with those. But if you're talking about modern day synths, I think Surge is one, if not the only one, I can put my hands on this very second and think about.
Wow, yeah, that's not a lot, but great that the glass is filling there as well. Great to hear.
The juice glass is half full.
Juice glass.
Where's your glass of juice? All right, with that, I think maybe it's time for another break.
So I've added the word draft onto this because, as Mike alluded to much at the beginning, we are not experts. This isn't something where Ableton's saying, hey, we're doing everything amazing, this is how you do it. We're not in that situation at all. But I will be talking about a bunch of principles that we've kind of come up with, that some of which I think are really shouldn't be very controversial and should be pretty obvious. And some of them we still have a lot to understand to improve on. I'm going to focus a lot on keyboard interaction principles before talking about a couple other ones. So these ones that you see on this page, I would think aren't really that controversial. We want to make sure that if you are making something accessible, especially with visual impairment in mind, that we want to make sure that all functionality is available from a keyboard. You shouldn't have to use a mouse to use the software. So make sure that we think of the keyboard as a primary interaction method. Don't expect that people can get visual feedback on both what they're doing, what they've clicked on, where they have navigated to. Make sure that the keyboard interactions are predictable. Something should be repeatable if someone wants to learn it. And if someone wants to use the experiences that they've had in other environments, in other DAWs, and other things that they use the screen reader with, we want it to be predictable and behave like they would expect it to based on prior experience. It needs to be intuitive and follow contextual expectations. Again, this is if we have groupings and things, you should be able to navigate those very efficiently. Make sure that there's efficient movement between objects with the same level I can't move my zoom. Yes, so we can move things that are on the same, that we can easily move between things that are on the same level of information hierarchy or have the same kind of behavior. As I said, none of these should be that controversial. This should be pretty much obvious, you'd think, but let's take a step away from Keynote for a moment and see how the most recent version of Live does with this. So what I've opened right here is Live 11. It's the demo set. Let's see. This is what I arrive on when I just open the set. Let's see what I can navigate to. I'm just going to press arrow keys here. Okay, great. I can go to the right. All right, I've hit the end. Let's go down. I can see that I've stopped moving. Oh, no, don't seem to be moving anymore when I go left, right. Let's go back up. Okay, I can go down over to the left again. Now I've stopped again. I can only see what's happening, no sound feedback. Okay, so I seem to have hit everything that I can navigate to with the arrow keys. What else would I often try to get around navigation? Let's try tab. Tab's a really common one to get between blocks. Oh, okay, well, I didn't quite go to a different block. I've gone and changed what I'm looking at. Again, no feedback that I can hear about what's happened. Let's try using the arrows here. Okay. Oh, I can see I'm moving a little tiny cursor up here. I'm going to use my mouse to highlight it, if you can see that. I can move back and forth there. Let's see, up and down. Oh, looks like I'm going through tracks. But again, I seem to be stuck in this one box. All right, tab didn't get me out of that box. Let's try shift tab. What happens then? Oh, so what have I done? Huh, looks like I can navigate back and forth on this bottom set, this area, which is our device and clip viewing area. But again, I still, oh, let's see, actually, before I get out of this, can I actually click on anything? So, nope. Trying left and right, I just move my highlight to the left and right, but up and down, I can't get in. I can't actually get into that device with my keyboard shortcut or my standard keyboard navigation tools. Let's go back. Now let's actually use the mouse. Let's try clicking. Let's just try clicking on the peak volume button. All right, I clicked on that, and now, oh, this time I can actually still see things moving. This was supposed to be my example of completely losing focus, but for some reason I'm keeping focus. But where I'm clicking on has nothing to do with where the arrows are actually, where my cursor is. So if you see me clicking here, my cursor is someplace totally different. Let's see if I, oh, okay, there we go. Now I've lost focus. I've just clicked in the groove box, and now when I press the keyboard to navigate, nothing happens. This is a good example of potentially a keyboard trap. So what we've just seen is that if I go back to Keynote and talk about some of these basic principles of keyboard interaction that I don't think are that controversial, Live has pretty well failed. There's not necessarily predictable, not always consistent, and I would question whether it's efficient. The last one that I showed was this concept of focus, where I clicked on something and all of a sudden I completely lost my focus. I couldn't navigate anywhere. I didn't know where I was anymore. Focus is really important if you are working with an application where you can't see where you are. You need to make sure that you can always know what element you are acting on, regardless of how you have arrived there. If I've arrived there with the mouse, I can see that the mouse is there. If I have arrived there through keyboard navigation, I need to know that I have also arrived there. And if I switch between the two, so if I want to go from mouse to keyboard navigation, I need to still be consistent with where I've been and how I've gotten there. The other reason that focus is super important is a technical reason, which is because focus is so important for someone to have a context for how they got to someplace so they can repeat that action and get there again, or undo that action if they want to. Because focus is so important for maintaining a state of where someone is in the software, it's actually mandatory for certainly the UI automation. I believe Mac screen reader also, or Mac's voiceover also very much wants focus, but certainly screen reader, the navigator, needs you to have an established focus within your software. Moving on further, keyboard interaction principles, a lot of them Live does not do very well at. Keyboard shortcuts are not just a convenience for power users. If you were here with Andre, there's a lot of things that someone needs to be able to do quickly. If someone is, for their job, using a DAW to accomplish something, we don't want it to be super slow for them. So that keyboard well that Till showed you, one of the ways that you can get around that is by having good shortcuts. These shortcuts won't just benefit someone who is a power user, because power users often love these shortcuts, but they will often help everyone, not just visually impaired people and power users. So make sure that you have good shortcuts and think about things already existing. You don't want people to have to make all of their own shortcuts, because that's just putting the work on them, and they have to figure out how to do it in the first place and how to get around anyway. Make sure that the shortcuts are findable, so you can put them in a navigate menu, you can put them in a context menu. You can also do things with, you can also do things where you have soft accessibility. So PDFs that people can read. Make sure you reuse interaction concepts. So what I mean by that is the concept that if I'm using the arrow keys to navigate in one section of Live, I should be able to use the arrow keys to navigate in another section of Live. It should be consistent throughout the software. Also, different OSs, well, OSs generally have a kind of standard set of navigation tools or things, shortcuts that are expected to behave in certain ways, such as tab, shift tab. It's very common throughout all software that those have a way of being used. Live does not follow that standard, but make use of these, especially someone who is used to using a keyboard to get around will know all of these inherently, and so it makes it much easier for them to intuitively get around your software. I'm also, this got a little bit confused with where that arrow is, but complementary shortcuts should use modifiers that build on the original. This idea is that in Live, Command T makes a new track. So if we're going to make a specific kind of track, like a MIDI track or a turn track, build upon that basic command, that basic shortcut, so that it can be intuitive and easier to remember how to get the result you want. Make sure that the shortcuts, this isn't in here, but often make sure that shortcuts make sense within their local area. You can have some global shortcuts that are software-wide, but in some context you maybe do want specific shortcuts that don't do things elsewhere, or navigation methods that don't do things elsewhere. I already talked about keyboard commands should be easily discoverable. Make sure that when you design your keyboard shortcuts, or especially your keyboard shortcuts, that they work across all international keyboards. Basically, don't always rely on proximity. For instance, Z and X are often next to each other on a keyboard. They are on an American keyboard, but they're not necessarily. I believe, for instance, on a German keyboard, they aren't in the same place. So you can't always assume that everything's going to work just because it works on one keyboard. Keyboard interactions should be designed and tested with the same standards as the rest of your software. As Till talked about with things being broken, as Andre showed with the MIDI editor being broken in Logic, or at least the speaking part of that being broken in Logic. All of this should be core so that you're delivering a consistent product to someone, that if something works, that it continues to work. And if you don't make it part of your if you don't design to the same standards, it's going to fall to the wayside, and it's not going to be maintained well, and it's not going to remain usable. Avoid looping in navigation. This is another one. If someone is trying to understand what the options are available by going through a list because they can't just read it, it's not obvious, especially if it's not alphabetized, when you go from the bottom of the list to the top of the list. And it takes away someone's ability to orient themselves. How many in from the top or how many in from the bottom just do you want to go to find this, to find whatever you're looking for? So generally avoid navigation. And then lastly, avoid keyboard traps. Keyboard traps, as have been mentioned, are a real dead end. Basically, if you can't navigate something and you have a visual impairment, you may need to have someone else come over to help you, or worst case, you may need to completely restart your software just because you can't figure out how to get out of the scenario you've ended up in. And neither of those are acceptable. Auditory feedback to keyboard interaction. This is a very big topic. Basically, all keyboard interactions should have some sort of auditory feedback. Everything you do, you should be able to know that it has succeeded or failed. If you are going through something that is changing context significantly, you might want to make sure that all of that is announced. Andre kind of showed how this works in the demo, and something, they do need to be relevant. If it's not that important, this is someone's primary way of knowing where they are in the software. If it's not that relevant, don't tell them. It needs to be concise. Again, if you're listening to something that's 10 words long when it only needs to be 2 words long, you're wasting someone's time, and this might be their job, and that's not cool. Make sure it's well ordered, because again, if we have something where, as Andre showed a perfect example of this, where the thing that's actually interesting is at the end of this phrase rather than at the beginning of the announcement. And so he has to sit through the whole thing to actually find out what's going on. And then make them configurable. Again, this matches what Andre was saying. You can actually, certainly with VoiceOver, you can configure VoiceOver to potentially include certain things and not include certain things. And someone who's a beginner to the software, where they need to learn how to use the software, get through everything and kind of mentally develop their map of where things are within the software, will want something different announced to them than someone who's an expert and knows where they are. So it needs to be configurable. And then lastly, on this topic, the screen reader does have default sounds for common generic activities. For instance, when I was talking about avoid looping, if you get to the end of a loop at the end of a list, there'll be a different sound from the screen reader. Make sure you tap into these and that they work with your software, because these are things that people who are trained at using screen readers know to expect, and it just helps them out. Lastly, these are kind of some big overarching principles. Accessible product design is not a one-time effort. This isn't something that you do it for one version and you stop working on it. And if you do that, you're not being fair to your customers, you're not being fair to your users, you're selling them a lie. Aim for longevity. Focus on iterative design that gets better every time. Progress over perfection. Whatever we do, it's not always the right thing the first time. And that's okay. Making some kind of an effort is better than making no effort. And just be ready to revise that effort by involving a diverse audience into your design process and let them give you feedback. And this goes back to Amy's point at the very beginning, which is, if you're unsure of how something is experienced, ask. Don't make the assumption. Ask someone for feedback, because they might know a lot better than you do, because it's probably much more lived experience. All of the dev team that's been looking at this, we're all sighted, so there's a lot of assumptions that we could make that are probably really, really bad. And it's important that we're humble to ask that question and ask our users and say, you help us out, because we don't really know. And hopefully some of the things we've told you have given you an insight into where to start. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Lucy.
I'm going to talk about more technical aspects of screen reader support. We talked a lot about design principles, UX principles, about our research, and Andre did a demo of screen reader. And now we're going to see So we have a first goal, which is, to get familiar with the language of accessibility APIs. So we want to understand on macOS and on Windows, actually, how we can build a cross-platform solution for our software, which can work with both of these platforms. We're going to talk only about desktop software, and we're also going to talk only about macOS and Windows platform. So here we have a diagram that I will describe. It illustrates the general flow of information when a user uses a screen reader and interacts with the software using the screen reader. So we have first a software UI. In our case, we will have a custom view framework. So a lot of view and controls that we'll build internally in our software, and we will assign specific attributes and action to those views and controls. All of those controls and views will go through our own accessibility API, which will build an accessibility tree of all of these objects. And we will give this tree of objects to the platform APIs, which will then give it further to the screen reader, and the user will be able then to hear and to be notified and then interact further using the keyboard. So first, the screen reader. So we talked a lot about it, so I don't want to explain again what is a screen reader. I just want to say that the screen reader user uses the keyboard to dispatch some actions to the software, and they receive audio feedback on what's happening in the software and audio notifications on any changes happening in the software. The main question that we have here is actually what is happening between the moment the user presses the key on their keyboard and the moment the software UI is actually updated. There's a lot of steps in between that we will try to understand. So in the middle of our diagram, we have the accessibility API. So first, our software API, which will try to build some objects, some pieces of code that our platform will understand. So I will focus first on those platform APIs on Windows and macOS, and we'll try to understand a little bit what they are and how we can work with them. So we have two main accessibility APIs. We have some legacy versions and some modern version. On macOS, it's called NS Accessibility Protocols. On Windows, it's called UI Automation. What's interesting for us is actually to focus on what is shared between those APIs, so we can build something that works for both of them. So what are the shared concepts? We have two core concepts, accessible objects and accessibility tree. So the accessibility tree, it's a tree-like representation of all the accessible objects of the software. That doesn't give a lot of information because we don't know what are accessible objects. So accessible objects are actually all the pieces of UI which are interactive, such as button, checkboxes, sliders, all sorts of controls like that, or informational pieces of the UI, such as status bar, paragraph of text in a help text, for example, or structural, such as a window or a group of controls. So this concept of accessible objects will come back further to it to see actually how we can make from our custom view framework to generate those accessible objects. And something else which is actually very important and shared among those two APIs is the concept of interfaces or classes. Both of those APIs provide interfaces or classes so that we can implement our own accessible objects. So what are those interfaces? So on macOS, we have a unified interface written in Objective-C and called NS Accessibility Element. Hard to pronounce. On Windows, we have a bunch of different interfaces. And for example, IRO Element Provider Simple, which takes care of navigation. But we have other interfaces, for example, to handle context menu or focus or things like that. So this is still very, let's say, conceptual, theoretical. So to understand a little bit more about how to actually what to do with those interfaces, I will show you a simple example of just a single button, which you just press, and a button that doesn't store any state or anything. It's just a button that you press and it does something. So on macOS, we'll have to deal with Objective-C. And to create our own accessible button, we will create an interface called My Button. So an interface is the equivalent of a class in C++. And we will implement this interface that we just talked about, and this accessibility element. We will inherit from this interface. And we will also implement a protocol called NS Accessibility Button. So there's two things that are interesting here. NS Accessibility element, as I told you, is a unified interface. So it comes with a lot of default behavior. So for example, it comes with an accessible role. We know whether the element is a button or a checkbox or something else. But in certain cases, we of course have to, we have some exceptions. Sometimes we need to, how can I say, like we need to very precisely override certain behaviors depending on our situation. For example, we need to say specifically where is the button in our accessibility tree. So we need to override methods to get to give the parents of the button, for example, a window, and potentially the children of the button. Second thing that is interesting here is NS Accessibility Button. So it's a protocol in Objective-C, which is the equivalent of a pure virtual class in C++. So we have to implement all of its function. And it's very defined. So it has only, of course, methods functions that relate to the role of a button. On Windows, so as I said, there's a little bit more interfaces. I will not describe all of them. Just briefly, we'll talk about IUnknown, which is every accessible element that we want to implement has to inherit from IUnknown, which takes care, for example, of the life cycle of the objects. We have one other which is interesting for us because we're implementing a very simple button. So we have IInvokeProvider, which gives us the ability to implement a method to perform just a single action without storing any state. So it's interesting for us because we just have a button, we just click on it, and there's no need to store state as we would, for example, for a checkbox. So this is roughly how we can play with those interfaces or classes to build our own accessibility button. So if we go further into this, how can we try to build a cross-platform solution? So cross-platform solution, for our example, it means having an API, which is a custom API, which understands both our view framework and the platform API. So we can actually enable people to use a screen reader with our software. So we at the top of our diagram, we are now dealing with our custom view framework. We have our views, our controls in our software, and we want to assign them specific attributes and actions. So let's see what this means. How to generate those accessible objects for all of our views and controls. Here again, we need to focus on the core aspects of things. So what are the core aspects of accessible objects? So they all have a position in the accessibility tree. They all have parents, potentially siblings, children, and this is very important for navigation. They all have a size and a position on the screen, and this is very important for focus so that these elements can be focused. They also have a name, which gets spoken aloud by the screen reader or, spoken aloud by the screen reader. And they also have specific characteristics depending on their function. This is very important for interaction. So specific characteristics depending on their function, it's very conceptual here as well, abstract. So if I take the example of a slider, for example, the volume slider, then those specific characteristics will be the current value of the slider in decibels, and as well as the range. So the minimum value and the maximum value. All of those things, all of those core aspects of accessible objects, we will call them attributes. On top of these attributes, besides having all of this information, this accessible object can also do a lot of things. They can handle user interaction. If I keep the example of the slider or the button, so the slider value can be changed along the range, or the button can be pressed, a menu can be opened, all of these interactions that you can have with elements of a UI. So all of these interactions are roles. So if I summarize all of these things, we have our accessible object, which are all the elements of the UI we can interact with, or that give us information, or that enable actually the end user to interact normally with the software. And they all have roles and attributes. The roles is what they claim to be, what they say they can do. So if I'm a button, it says I can do this, I can be pressed, but to actually give the capability to be pressed for the button, they need to implement a certain protocol. And once this certain protocol is implemented, it gives the accessibility client. So for our example, it will be screen reader. It gives the screen reader the ability to modify these attributes or to just read them. So read the name, understand where the position in the tree, but also to set a new value. For example, set a new value to our slider. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about accessible object, there's something else that is important. As I said in the very beginning, the screen reader user needs some feedback about what they're doing with the software. They change a value, they need to be aware that the value has changed. And this is the concept of notifications. So as I said, yeah, so when something happens in the UI, whether it's a consequence of a user action or not, something happens, the screen reader user needs to be aware of that change. And there's a lot of different notifications that we can list, but those 4 main ones are very important to implement for our solution. So when an element has received focus, we need to be aware of it. When a group has been opened or closed, a value is changed, or the UI structure has changed. For example, just a pop-up window appeared. We need to actually know. And this is a very important concept. So now that we get a little bit more in the theory, I want to come back a bit more in the code, in the practical side of things, and see how we can have a very rough cross-platform implementation for an accessible object. So we'll start with an enum action, which will represent all the ways the screen reader can interact with the object, so a view or a control of our software. We also have an enum for attributes, and it will have all these attributes that I talked about before, all the values that the accessibility clients can ask for and potentially change for some of them. And finally, from these, we'll be able to create our accessible object class with a bunch of functions so that we can actually perform those actions, or we can actually set specific attributes or get their values. So to summarize very quickly, hopefully we understood a bit more the vocabulary around those platform APIs. We understood a bit more how we can try to implement something that will work for both of them by focusing on the very core, like the most common aspects of both of them. And for our custom view framework, we managed to understand how to build our software accessibility API. We understand that the 2 most important things is to have accessible objects that sit within a tree. And also we need to handle notifications. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks a lot. One moment. Great. Thanks a lot, Laurel and Lucy. That was really informative, I hope. We have some more questions for reflection. Maybe we can first actually start with everybody in the group. Does anybody have anything on reflecting on any of these questions from our perspective? How could you answer some of these?
There's one which is more of an anecdote, but I think it's important when implementing some screen reader prototypes and testing it while looking at the software. I think it's an interesting challenge in the sense that we're not really able to test it fully ourselves, having in mind that we're always using our eyes, being all sighted developers working on this. So I think this is an interesting challenge of being able to see in this situation.
As far as fundamental user experience assumptions that we depart from, I think Laurel hit the nail on the head with the tab and shift tab. This is everywhere. Like any website you use, you can interact with it like this. And we decided that it's better for something else a long time ago. So I think it's an interesting way to kind of reflect on your software, to look at it from this other side of what, rather than here's how it's special and unique, how is it actually alienating people who kind of come into the situation with some assumptions about how software works?
I think maybe something the team could do is take themselves away from the actual UI and go to really rudimentary paper prototyping, because then that actually takes away your options and you have one person who is the API or the interface, and you get to say what happens if I press this and see if it meets your expectations or not, because you're not getting the feedback that you would normally. And that can kind of help with some of that user experience of like just testing without having the ability to override what your expectation is, because you can see and interact with the thing that you want to do. It's very easy to get frustrated and let your impatience take the best of you with these things. So just try it out on paper first and then see where it breaks down for you.
That's a great idea. I think especially when maybe trying to replicate some of the common workflows that in a DAW-like life consist of a lot of jumping around between many different places. I think about creating an automation envelope for a device in a point in time in an arrangement where a certain change in a very particular parameter is supposed to happen via automation. These kinds of things, like to try to do all the navigation and selection and interaction that requires. That's where it's going to be very challenging. So when the software has many different parts and very many levels of the hierarchy, the structural groupings that Lucy talked about.
Yeah, I think something that's come up quite a lot as well that we've spoken about is Ableton as a DAW is very different from some of the other paradigms that we encounter in very linear other DAWs. And so like when it comes to the kind of clip views and arrangers, like what piece of information is the most useful to know at all points is a really hard thing to put your finger on, because you want to read out that something's a play button because that's the most important function. But if you have 100 of them in a row, you're not quite sure which one you're going to trigger. So you want to have the context first, maybe, but then that could just be irritating if you're very, your muscle memory about your session is there. So we have to really think about the way people make music and the things that we learn when we're performing as well, because I think we take for granted that like a lot of us have these mental models that we've just adopted. I don't look at my keys every time I'm playing them. I don't look at the keyboard. I just know the gestures because I've spent some time learning. So we have to kind of appreciate that there's this navigation of the pro expert to novice kind of space in there as well. And it's all a bit like, fundamentally, which piece of information do we present first? That might change over time. That's possible. And yeah, think about that too.
And it might change depending on what someone is primarily using the software for, because the thing about a DAW is that certain people use it for like very niche power using, certainly in live, for instance, some people work only in an arrangement view, some people work only in the session view, some people spend all their time doing sound design, and everyone's going to have different things that they want a little bit more focus on, and so it makes everything a little bit more complex.
Would anybody like to share anything from the audience? I guess Stefan replied to the first question. We're using a UI SDK, not Juice, that might not provide support for the platform accessibility APIs, which will hinder us if not solved at the SDK level. Stefan says they're using VST GUI from Steinberg.
So all I can say on this point is if you discover that they're not, ask them to do it. Like the first thing you can do is ask the team how possible it is for them to do it, because the more people that do this, it's going to open that up for everybody who's using that framework. It's a conversation that we have to have more and more, especially in 2021. It's a shame that we've waited this long to have the conversations, but just ask and you'll probably find out where they are with their accessibility effort.
And that goes back to something from the talk earlier this week about iOS accessibility. If you're using a framework that doesn't already support accessibility and you don't develop that framework, ask and ask and ask and ask and ask and keep asking until they decide to get it done. Jason, you've raised your hand. Welcome to the chat. How are you doing? You're now allowed to unmute.
Currently on. Okay, hi everyone.
Hey.
And
hey.
Hi, and first of all, let me say congratulations to everyone who presented. This is absolutely brilliant, right? I'm sitting here and I'm just in awe, and it's awesome. That's all I can say about it. So thanks, first of all, for your interest in accessibility and, the passion everyone is showing here. I've been fortunate to meet many of you in person, and you guys are just amazing. So that's my first thing that I wanted to say. And I just wanted to touch on two things that you guys spoke about. So in terms of being able to understand what a visually impaired person needs. For example, I did an in-person visit to an accessibility group at a company, and what I did, I had them all close their eyes, and they had to navigate a piece of software using voiceover along with me. So everybody was at their terminals, and nobody was allowed to look at their screens. And I say, okay, let's get another track. Let's name this track. And I took them through it, and I had them tell me, okay, what did the screen reader say? What's the value of this slider? So an exercise like that may be something of interest, right? Where nobody's allowed, where you actually drive a piece of software, using screen readers as a sighted person without, of course, you're going to have one person who is familiar with screen readers lead the exercise. But I think it's a nice way for you to put yourself in the position of a visually impaired person, right? So that's one thing I did, that I thought, worked pretty well. And the other little thing I'm thinking of is that, when we speak about, a button or a checkbox or something like that, and you want to get an idea of how much verbosity is needed, how much speech is needed. A good rule of thumb is that what you need to see as a sighted person is exactly the same for a visually impaired person. So, for example, as Andre pointed out, just to hear the word mute instead of toggle mute on or something like that. So a good guide may be you look at the screen and you say, okay, what do I need to see? Although for you it might be a light turn on or a button change color or something like that. So, but a general rule is that as little information as you need is probably exactly the same amount of information that a visually impaired person needs. So yeah, just my 2 thoughts on how you could probably quickly gather the information. So if you don't have a visually impaired person around, you could just say, okay, this button changes, I need it to say on. I need it to say off when the button is not clicked. Or checked to unchecked, enable, disabled. You might need more than that. You might just need the name of the control, mute, enabled, mute, disabled. So as little as you need to see is normally a good gauge, to know how much a blind person needs to see. Hope, that kind of is a bit helpful in some way.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Jason, and I can tell you that you've had us all nodding along. So I just want to say that there is a lot of visual feedback among the other presenters of us all nodding our heads like really dramatically to this point.
Thanks, Amy.
On that point as well, there are companies out there that provide simulators or other things that can simulate different visual impairments. So if you really want to experience something or your software through a visual impairment, there are places where you can acquire different types of glasses that provide this, or actual software that does like an overlay and shows you different color blindness or different levels of tunnel vision, and those are things that you can do as well. But as we've said, like when it comes to screen readers, the best thing is just to turn yours on and turn off your screen and see where you go. You won't get very far the first time. None of us do. And just don't feel like, I can't do this. But you have to understand, if that's the level that you're getting, that's the level of frustration that you're meeting very, very early on. If it's even opening and just authenticating your software, that can be just like, why would anybody try to go any further?
Audio submenu.
And
Open chat panel.
on that note as well, I really love it when I have clients tell me, well, we were going to do it, but nobody's requested that we do accessibility yet. And I love that, because if it's not accessible, nobody's going to be requesting it. Like they're not using it. That's why, because they can't get into it. So like, who's going to bother telling you, look, I can't even open this thing. They're just going to move on to the next product that they can, and they're going to test that, and they're going to use that as their like comparative analysis tool, especially if they're working in a studio. Perhaps they're working in a studio that works like an education setting, even like Mike said, where the primary audience is visually impaired music makers. They're just not going to bother going any further. They're just going to test something else and find the thing that works and invest in that as much as they can. And they'll raise their problems with that person or that product because they can. Like getting through those first functional stages and putting it across your whole ecosystem is just really, really important. So just start small, start doing something, expose one thing, and then maybe you'll get some feedback to what to do next.
Yeah, on that point, this whole journey really started when Mike and another product owner at Ableton said, yeah, try and make a button pressable. That's where we started for real. It's been a couple of years since then, but I think a couple of years well spent.
Did you make the button pressable?
That's secret information. We cannot talk about that.
You'll have to ask Andre. He might have tried. Yeah, so we do have a bit more time. I'm curious if anybody in the audience has any other questions. Otherwise, we really appreciate your time today. Michael, I will bring you in. Hello. You can unmute yourself.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks again for the wonderful presentation. It's been phenomenal to hear so many other people really passionate about the space. I started working in Ableton Live with the Ableton Live teaching expert here in Utah about 3 years ago. And like what you were saying, Spencer, you immediately opened VoiceOver and it's like, here, just a block. And that was all we got. So we immediately switched over to Logic, and that's where it's been for a lot of our research. I just wanted to have a quick question and what your thoughts were between the handshake between developers and designers. I know a lot of the time, for example, you have designers who want a very vivid GUI or something like an overlay that's not easily accessible because the screen reader might not necessarily know about it immediately. So how do you work with wanting to provide a really visual interface with a ton of information, but also format it in an accessibility way? I know for government, for example, for the United States, I worked in health and human services, and we started at the design level because we noticed if we put it past designers and now in developers, we had a lot of animosity towards one another. So I just a quick question on overall thoughts between how do we decide that early on so that we're all on the same page? And I think it really deals with your company mantra, how you want to go about that. But any thoughts would be really appreciated. Thank you.
So I think I could answer that a little bit. The main thing is to get the designers on side by setting up an expectation of, for instance, keyboard accessibility. So, involve them in writing out these principles, like the principles that Laurel presented. Get them involved at the beginning so they understand why these principles exist for keyboard accessibility and the expectations of navigation. And if they're involved from the beginning, then when some of them shows up with like a really cool, I don't know, semi-transparent floating window, it's like, okay, but it doesn't meet the needs, it doesn't meet the expectations. I find that at Ableton, the designers are often very obsessed with, how can I say this? Like, no, not as a bad thing, but like making things the same, right? I mean, rather than saying we need like a completely different GUI for every product that's totally fancy and looks unique, it's often about like, how can we use similar visual paradigms so that when we open a new part of the UI, it doesn't confuse people. And that thinking also works for keyboard interactions, where it's like, these are the keyboard interactions we have across Live. Now you're adding a new component. Start by supporting existing keyboard interactions. Don't break them. So yeah, get them in as early as possible.
From a consultancy point of view as well, working across many areas of a company, I think you always have to be very aware that people can often be defensive about what they don't know, or when you're coming in and saying the work that they've been doing for such a long time is taking things down a wrong path. So Jason's a very big advocate for this as well, is talking about inspiring people over saying you're obligated to do this. So like, rather than go in and point out everything that's been done badly over the years, talk about like, hey, have you seen this new cool thing that we could work on together to make it a little bit more accessible in that way? And don't just try not to be like, pulling and picking apart people's work, because people, we're all very, very kind of respond differently to that kind of criticism. And I think just trying to avoid those kind of ideas that is conflict or fault is there for anybody. It's not. It's just like, we all need to do better and we can all do better together. And those are the kind of attitudes you need to inspire with it when you're working in a group. Because yeah, for sure, you're always going to get different approaches, especially if those two areas of a company are quite disconnected. But you're going to have to try, and the early, like getting people in from the earliest point, as Mike says, is just the best way to do that. And to say, hey, look, we've kind of all left this, so we need to do better. And we're all like, everybody's in the same place and everybody's in the same headspace. So don't feel bad. Let's have an idea session about how we can do this.
I'd like to add, one of the people say, part of the reason you have so much of a team here is because when Tillman talked about how we did 23 interviews, and that included, we had designers, we had a designer in on that as well, who's basically, the keyboard principles weren't mine. They're ones that he wrote up, but he couldn't join us tonight. So the fact that so many of us sat in and watched people be frustrated and struggle to do things that should have been easy if we had designed, well, I'm not going to say if we, because they weren't using Ableton because they couldn't use Ableton. But if the products were designed better and were designed with them in mind, it really made it easy to empathize with the problem. And even if we don't know all the answers ourselves, we can see that it's a genuine problem. And so we can it's made us all more excited about solving things rather than being more concerned about saying, well, I think the way I did it was right, when you can see people being so frustrated. And I think the fact that we did put in real effort into building empathy amongst the team and including a designer within that has been really helpful in moving things forward.
Yeah, it's the fact that you had this external force pushing it forward rather than an internal fight to push it forward. So having that external viewpoint and having people come in from outside is also really, really helpful, just to put everybody in the same kind of space.
Yeah.
I'd like to add quickly, or I don't know if we're out of time, but
no, we've got a couple of more minutes.
This also goes towards, or this goes into the self-understanding what a designer does too. A lot of designers react very allergic if they're being called the people that make things look pretty and things like that. So if and if that's the case, then a designer can be actually called out on, for example, a limited definition of what they then design, what the interfaces are that they design. So in our company, for a very long time, and that's also something to slowly change, when people talked about the UI, the user interface, they meant the GUI, the graphical user interface. So now we can start having a conversation about the exclusivity of that user interface, or that there are other user interfaces that also need to be designed. And then it all of a sudden becomes like an interesting design challenge that meets the understanding of that the designer has of themselves, what they do. It's a bit weird to talk about that, but yeah, I don't know. That helps also to no, this is actually a serious design challenge. This is not a side gig or something.
We've got one more question in the Q&A from Jose. Are there any specific considerations for bringing accessibility to audio processors or plugins? I'm excited to see what is available in Juice. I think one of the most important things there is with regards to grouping of controls. One of the, it's really common for a plugin to have like a few hundred parameters in its window. And one thing that's really awful is, like, as Till described, these keyboard wells or these navigation wells where you're just in a massive list of things and it's tough to get around. With grouping, you can give the same sort of context that you give to your sighted users, where they see outlines or they maybe see clusters of controls in different parts of the window. You can express that to a screen reader user using groupings. And this is a really fundamental piece of the design aspect of screen reader support. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think as well to add something that was covered by the folks at Amplify in Kane's talk earlier this week. Just then when you have those groupings, you need to think about presenting what's the key piece of information about them that you need to know what they do, up front, and how do we make sure that that's the thing that's presented first? So yeah, it's all about giving the right context.
And we just have one more comment from Jason. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Currently unmuted.
Okay, yeah, I just thought this one was pretty important based on the last couple statements people made about people being criticized and having different ways of doing things. So on a project I recently worked on, I encountered exactly that. So for example, we would it was on a hardware keyboard, and you would spin a dial on the keyboard, and as you spin the dial, it would say the name of the patch and then say loaded when you press down on the dial to load the patch. However, you could also load the patches by pressing the left and right arrow buttons. So my thing was, I thought there was too much information. One group of people, including myself, thought there was too much information, when you press the arrows, because as you learn the interface and you become more proficient, you don't need to hear the name of the patch and loaded and whatever extra information. So, and the other group thought, well, that it needed to be said either way, whether you turn the dial or use the arrows. And we went back and forth for a while, and after having some good conversation, we came up with a perfect solution. If you turn the dial and press it, it will tell you the name of the patch followed by loaded. Whereas if you press the arrows alone, it will directly load the patch and just say the name of the patch. So it serves. So I was thinking, these are the kind of compromises that could happen, and the best solution happens, when you can put your heads together, because each side had value. Each side's opinion had a lot of value. And I think we came up with the perfect solution. So that's just kind of what it is, in terms of big teams working together. And, so nobody's right, nobody's wrong. It's just different opinions. And normally, if you take the best from each side, you're going to find the perfect solution.
That really reminds me of the point before about choice being important. Giving people more than one way to do the same thing, and maybe providing a slightly different experience, but that being robust. Would anybody like to say anything to close out? No? All right, well, thank you, everybody. It's been a real pleasure to share with you. It's a little late here, but I'm still feeling wide awake, so it's been a blast.
Try to post it to everyone. Let's give it up for our panelists. Thank you. Type message here, edit text.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who attended.
What a perfect ending. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good night. Menu item.
Good night.
Type message.